I've been very happy to hear that people have found the first video I did on recording piano to be helpful. Turns out it's helped me as well. Something about laying out my thoughts really inspired me to experiment some more. That led to some discoveries and refinements that I will now share with you. So I'm going to build on some of the ideas that I presented in my first video. You might want to check that one out before this one. I'll start by showing how I refined the proximate mics, or the close-up mics. Then I'll contrast that setup with a Bloomline approach, which I see as another great way to go for recording piano. There's a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. So first I want to show you a small change that I made to what I called the proximate mics in my first video. If you recall, this is what they looked like then. And now this is what I've arrived at. You can see they look fairly similar, but it almost might look as though I've taken the tilt or the angle out of it. In fact, even though the mic is flat this way, they are rolled such that the figure of eight has the front part pointing again diagonally down at the strings, the back part out this way, which does manage to avoid reflections off the lid. By the way, this is just relevant for those of you who have ribbon mics. But I found that arranging the mic with the ribbon on the same plane of the strings captured a fuller array of overtones. Maybe it just is vibrating more sympathetically, I don't know. But I think you'll see what I mean. I've really not done much to the treble mic other than, again, get it on the same plane as the strings. So one of the things that first video inspired me to do is to see if I could better solve the elephant problem. You can see I've got this part of the instrument recorded pretty well. I've got the bass recorded, but there's an obvious gap right here. And so I've actually added a mic underneath the piano. It's an AEA R84, which is another ribbon mic. Not that any of these mics have to be ribbon, but that's just what I have preferred using. And let me tell you a little bit about the placement. I'm actually pointing to it right now. And once again, like I described in my first video, I wasn't aiming for the bridge. I wanted to get a little bit off of that. Even though this is receiving the energy from the strings and from the hammers, it's really as that energy starts to get amplified and warmed up by the soundboard that we get that quality sound. So it's about right here. By the way, this is probably a good time to mention that I have an upcoming video plan where I'm going to get into what I do to mix these projects for classical piano. So make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss that one. But back to this mic underneath the piano, I really want you to hear what this does for the recording. So I'm really happy with the result that I get from that setup that I've been describing. But sometimes I use a popular method, which is the Bloomline pattern. In fact, I used Bloomline in a recent project that was featured in one of my videos. What's nice about Bloomline is that it's a coincident pattern, and so you don't have to really concern yourself with any phasing issues. And when you think about combining the Bloomline pattern with a mid-side miking pattern, you have two configurations that are nicely coincidental. So as long as you get those to match up, you are golden. Perhaps because it eliminates any phasing issues, we tend to get a really natural, clean result with Bloomline. In fact, if you just have two mics that have figure of eight capability, that's probably the best recording that you're going to get. One of the reasons why the Bloomline pattern sounds so good is that it kind of gets to this overarching problem we've been talking about, how to get the immediacy of the instrument as well as the ambience of the room. While the front of the figure eight pattern is getting the immediacy of the instrument, the back of the figure eight is capturing a little bit of the room sound. So while it can be pretty easy to get a really good result with Bloomline, there are some things to think about in terms of placement within a piano. Thinking back to the flashlight analogy from video 1, I want to make sure when I am doing a Bloomline that my mics are shining a light on with a direct hit on the piano. If it's too far back here, I might be hitting the wall or the lid or the music rack over there. So I get it kind of in the piano. I find if I get too close, the sound is a little harsh. It's also overly separated, so you really hear the pan of the treble in one extreme. So getting it to, I do about here, seems to balance it out a little bit. Another decision point is whether to have the mics like this or like this. I find that having the one pointed toward the treble on the bottom it gives me the clearest treble signal. If it's up here, it's actually aiming toward the bass area, and so I have two mics that are amplifying the bass. Now that could be useful if you have a really bright piano that you're trying to kind of tame down a little bit. There's also a subtle decision in terms of how to pan it this way. I actually don't do it directly on, but sort of taking the bridge and being perpendicular to that with the central axes. And that, once again, allows me to get a little better hit on the treble section. You can actually tell where the bridge is underneath the piano by looking at the buttons that fasten it. By the way, if you're limited to two mics that are fixed in cardioid, some of the principles that I just discussed will apply to, say, an XY configuration or ORTF. So whether you have a mic locker to die for, or just getting started with two mics, or anything in between, I hope the principles and suggestions that I've laid out in these first two videos will prove helpful. Upcoming videos include the one I mentioned where we'll get into the mixing aspect of classical piano. I also want to do one where I contrast ribbon mics and condenser mics using the very same configuration, so you can really get a sense of the decision between those two types of mics. So be sure to become a subscriber, and I'll see you soon.